Hi, everyone. I think we're ready to go. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. CISO, it's your time to be the work from home productivity hero. Today's webinar is being presented by Isolate. I'm Marielle Sable, the marketing manager here at Isolate, and I'm going to be your moderator during this webinar. Before I introduce you to our presenter, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping rules. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share with colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. Please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speaker at any point, just type it in there and I will either pose it to our speaker at the time or hold it for the discussion portion at the very end of the event. We have all attendees automatically muted during the session. Today's presenter is Mark Gaffin, the CEO of Isolate. Mark is a successful CEO, entrepreneur, and cybersecurity veteran with a track record of leading and growing emerging businesses. Mark is a thought leader who has appeared before the U.S. Congress, FDIC, and the Federal Trade Commission on cybersecurity and identity theft topics. And now I'm going to hand the floor over to Mark. Mark, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Mariel, and hello everyone. It's great to see so many of you joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, and I can even see people here that are joining us from geographies that it's evening already, so we definitely appreciate you guys taking out of your evening to join us on this session, in which I'm going to speak primarily about a new concept called Workspace Isolation, which we think is essentially the ultimate security and productivity enabler for remote workforce. As security practitioners, I think you all know that a big part of the CISO or security person in an organization today is essentially being Dr. No, constantly telling people what they can't do and what they shouldn't be doing and what they can't install because it's dangerous or violating security protocol in the organization. In a recent poll that we did with 70 CISOs from Fortune 1000 companies, 62% of CISOs told us that their organizations restrict browsing. And that means that every time someone in the organization receives this website blocked screen, they're thinking about the security team, they're frustrated, they are most likely being prevented from doing something that's critical for their job. In addition to that, 70% of the CISOs told us in that same survey that they restrict installing apps or applications. The most common applications are the ones that you can see on your screen. And while I definitely think that Netflix may not be appropriate for corporate devices, although in today's day and age with everyone working from home, we're all using our corporate devices for some of our personal stuff as well. But most of the other tools, including even Facebook, are productivity tools or collaboration tools or tools that we need for the ongoing work, especially today when we need to collaborate digitally with co-workers, partners, external parties. These are definitely productivity tools that we need to be able to use in our organization. The irony is that essentially with more and more security products being built or added to our stack, we aren't restricting any less or blocking any less. We're continuing to increase our security measures and limit our users even more, which is not essentially the right way to go in our opinion. The other interesting aspect from the survey that came up is that 50% of the CISOs predicted that less than 50% of the workforce will return to work in the office or return from home once COVID-19 has essentially settled down, which means that 50% of our workforce is going to be permanently remote, working from their homes, on the road, or different locations other than the office. The implications of that are essentially that productivity is going to become one of the key metrics that organizations start measuring because of this new situation. We know what productivity levels used to be like when we were all in the office or we had some type of a base or large employee base in the office, but some remotely. Productivity is going to be one of the things that boards are going to be asking about, CEOs are going to be asking about. How's our productivity? Are we keeping productivity levels to where they used to be with everyone now working remotely? The big aspects of collaboration, or the big aspects of productivity are going to be around collaboration. How do we enable our employees to collaborate internally with third parties. What type of communication capabilities are we going to give them? And all of these tools and services that they will need to consume are some of the biggest challenges for the security folks, because they essentially inherently deal with either, if it's the collaboration and the communication tools, they're dealing with potential infiltration of malware or threats into the organization, and also the exfiltration of potential data out of the organizations. And therefore, these tools and these areas in our IT fabric are going to require a lot of attention. We essentially need to give our employees more IT freedom now in order for them to be able to do their jobs in this new environment that's being created. Isolate's been focused over the last 4 years in essentially creating this isolation on the endpoint, creating multiple environments in which people can do two different things, are completely isolated from each other on a single workstation. And while we've primarily been focused on what we call the privileged users in the organization, what we've heard from our customers over the last 6 months since COVID's broke is that they need this type of technology and this type of infrastructure to enable everyone in the organizations to enjoy it and to essentially be able to deploy this type of technology to the masses within the organization. That's why we've come up with a new solution, which is called, the concept is Workspace Isolation, which essentially enables organizations to instantly deploy and manage virtual environments on any workstation. You still get strong VM-based isolation, that anything that happens in that virtual environment will be contained and remains in that virtual environment. It's now deployable at mass scale in minutes, literally through a light agent, as simple as installing Teams or Zoom or any other collaboration tool. The key thing is it does not require a separate operating system or a license or an image, which means that you don't have to manage all that or bring that. This virtual environment can now be spun up instantly on someone's device without having to bring all that overhead. And all these virtual environments can essentially be centrally managed from the cloud. This is typically how implementing workspace isolation would look like on a corporate device. If this is your Windows 10 corporate device, that's fairly locked down, you've got all your security measures on it, you've got your productivity tools such as email, browsing, etc. Workspace isolation essentially enables you to instantly create this virtual environment on the user's device without having, again, to bring an operating system or an ISO or an image. Determining its policies, in this case, creating a less restricted virtual operating system that can connect directly to the internet and in which the user can install all the productivity tools that they need to. These could be browsing, they could be YouTube videos they could be watching, all the Slacks of the world, the Box, Dropbox, all these type of collaboration tools that they need, which are essentially all isolated because they are running in this environment from the corporate operating system and the corporate network. Of course, if the user somehow contracts malware because they're doing certain things that you would not let them do on their corporate operating system, the malware is contained in this virtual environment and cannot break out, not through the operating system because it's in a secure virtual machine, and not through the networking because the communication of this virtual environment, which is a full-blown operating system, is completely tunneled out to the internet. In the same survey, 80% of the CISOs told us that they don't grant admin rights to users, which essentially is one of those things that gets people down and doesn't let them do some of the things that they need to do. In this type of environment, you could grant them admin rights in this environment. They could install all the applications that they needed, again, without having to jeopardize the security of the corporate operating system, because this is a strong virtual machine boundary. From a manageability perspective, all these endpoints and these workspaces can essentially be managed from the cloud. You can provision new users through a SaaS application onto their devices. You can create fine-grained security, networking, and clipboard policies, being able to give you all the controls that you need to manage, to lightly manage these virtual environments. And even deploy and bundle applications directly into this virtual environment, into the workspace, on the end user's device. It's essentially a way to deliver a full-fledged managed environment onto users' devices in which they can do different things. From a controls and policies perspective, you can create different networking rules for the unrestricted virtual operating system. What IPs it can connect to, what IPs it can't connect to. Same goes for domains. You can create fine-grained clipboard controls, allowing you to determine what can be copied in and out of this virtual environment, and the transition of data between the host and this operating system. You can determine whether the virtual operating system can have access to USB devices, what USB devices, whether it can access the webcam or print through printers that are connected to the host. These could be network printers or other printers that are all connected to the host, and you have the control in the cloud-based management to determine the policy around that. Same goes for data leakage and encryption. You can determine what type of encryption capabilities you want on the virtual disks of this operating system, and you can even remotely wipe and lock this entire environment by click of a button from the cloud in the admin console where you manage all these environments. This is essentially how Workspace Isolation appears to the end user. If this is the user's regular corporate desktop, with a click of a button, they can essentially, with a hotkey, they can move into their virtual environment, which looks to them just like another desktop. Not only is it a separate operating system, but its entire settings have been synced with the host operating system that they're sitting on top of, to essentially make this look like an extension of their desktop. Their time, their clock, their locale, all the settings that they are typically accustomed to setting on their host are inherited or pulled over into this environment, so it looks like just another desktop that's part of their corporate environment, while it's actually a completely separate operating system. The file system in this operating system is essentially dummied down or reduced in scope to make the user feel that this is not a full-blown operating system with a full drive, but a set of friendly folders in which they can save their work, they can do all their tasks, and they can access their data in a very, very simple way. And that's essentially the user experience for the user. There's some other great use cases for using this technology. One of them is a secure way to implementing VPN split tunneling. And in the survey that we did, 45% of CISOs told us that they don't allow split tunneling for security reasons. And 70% of those that do allow split tunneling have significant concerns around security. And the reason being is when you're doing split tunneling and you're essentially connecting your VPN to the corporate network, but then you're also connecting to the internet and allowing multiple applications that you potentially don't want running through your corporate network. In this environment, you're bridging the internet and your corporate environment, making the device essentially this bridge. Using Workspace Isolation, what you can do essentially is create this isolated boundary around all the applications that shouldn't be tunneled through your corporate network, but that are going out directly to the internet. And this gives you a secure environment that tunnels directly out of the internet, and anything coming in from the internet, any threats that can potentially come in, are contained in this virtual environment and cannot propagate onto the user's device and then into the corporate network through the VPN that they're now connected through. When you look at this compared to some other alternatives that are out there, the most common one today is browser isolation. And the differences between Workspace Isolation and browser isolation is essentially the fact that, here you're talking about a full-fledged operating system, not just browsing capabilities. The user can run and install any application that they want to. They can work on files, they can be as productive as they need to. It's literally like having another laptop for their additional tasks that they need to do, and not just a separate browser that's limited in its functionality. The other key aspect is that Workspace essentially runs a local browser. It's running on the device itself. That means that you get a native-like performance. It literally looks like the user's using their browser on their device. There's no latency. There's no potential of breaking interactive and rich applications that often happens with browser isolation, in which the website itself or the web pages itself are rendered somewhere in the cloud and then streamed through video or some other technology to the user's browser. this is a native browsing experience and has full compatibility out of the box with any type of website or web application. Another very common use for workspace isolation is how to manage BYODs, or essentially non-corporate devices. These could be unmanaged contractor devices. These could be devices or personal devices of employees that are now working from home. They could be franchises that bring their own equipment into the franchise but need to connect to your corporate systems. Any other offshore third parties, and even in M&A integrations in which the acquiring party or the target essentially have got their corporate device, but they need to give each other access or isolated access to the other one's network. This is another use case in which you can use workspace isolation in this case. The way this would play out essentially, if this is your non-corporate device, your BYOD, the workspace essentially acts as a secure zone to access the corporate environment. And in this environment, or in this example, you have the non-corporate applications and potentially malware on that device. And now you want to give the user access to some corporate resources such as Office 365, your SAP, or any other business application that you have. You typically want them to VPN into your corporate network. Doing this on a single device essentially introduces a lot of threats into your corporate network. But using workspace isolation, you can essentially deploy this in a separate operating system, a separate virtual environment that you can manage remotely. You can deploy your security software into it. You can lock it down, not give that user admin rights. Again, loosely managing, but having a tight grip on this isolated operating system and allowing them from here connectivity into the corporate network. By doing so, you can restrict connectivity into your corporate network only from this isolated environment. So anything else that's on it has no access into your corporate environment. You can prevent any data loss, because if users download files from your corporate environment into their workspace, with policies that you can put in place, they won't be able to copy content from the workspace onto their non-corporate operating system or their personal device. And if you need to, as soon as you want to decommission the workspace on their personal device, you can wipe or lock it immediately, and making this entire environment essentially go away. If you look at some of the other alternatives for enabling BYODs or corporate access from BYODs, the leading alternative is VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, or Desktop as a Service solutions. In the survey that we did, 60% of CISOs told us that their employees are not very happy with the user experience. There's latency. If you're offline, there are challenges. The entire the interactiveness of virtual desktop solutions have challenges. And 3/4, 70%, 75% of the CISOs rated the return on investment to be medium to low, really because of the back-end infrastructure costs associated with VDI solutions. If you look at how this type of a solution, the workspace isolation technology, stacks up versus VDI or desktop as a service, first of all, the workspace runs locally, which means that you get a great native-like user experience. It works when you're offline. You don't have to be connected to the internet. If you lose connectivity, you can still continue to working just like you are with your laptop or your home device today. It will support all your peripherals out of the box. These could be your USB drives, printers, webcams, everything supported without having to go or jump through many hoops in order to make this work in VDI types of environments. And Workspace has a better return on investment. You have no additional operating system costs. You're not deploying special software in the data center, and you have no data center costs associated with this because you're not running the workloads in the data center. You're running them locally on the end user's device. The ultimate question that we asked the CISOs is, what would happen if you would provide less restrictions on your users? And 50% of them told us that they think that if they applied less restrictions on users, it would improve significantly their employee productivity. We think this is an opportunity, essentially, with this type of a technology to move from being this Dr. No to essentially turning into the productivity hero. So that's a quick introduction to Workspace Isolation. I'm now going to open the floor up for any questions. Mariel, I'd love you to feed them to me as they have come in.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. So we have several questions that have been submitted by the audience through the Q&A chat box. As a reminder, if you have any questions that you have not yet submitted, please enter it in either the Q&A or the chat, and we will go through as many questions as this allows. The first question we have is, how is this approach different from just running a local VM like VirtualBox on a user's device?
Thanks, Mariel. Well, it's a great question. It's a question that we often hear. The main differences, I would say, are three. First of all, you don't have to bring a separate operating system or ISO when using Isolate's technology. When you install a local VM, you install the hypervisor, and then you have to bring your installation disk. You have to bring your ISO. You have to install that image. You have to manage it. With our technology, you essentially are using the same binaries on the device itself to instantly create another local VM using the same binaries. The second thing is that this entire system is governed and managed from the cloud. If you install VirtualBox, everyone does what they want. This gives you the utmost control remotely on all the parameters that I spoke about. So this becomes a full managed service of virtual environments. The third thing I would say is around usability. So the way we've implemented this and the way we've learned that users want to use virtual technology on their endpoints. I'm not talking about security researchers or super techie developers that know what a VM is, but when you're trying to deploy this to the masses, people don't know what virtual environments are. The way we've built this from a user experience perspective is, as I showed earlier, essentially like an extension to their desktop. To the end user, you can explain, hey, this is an environment in which you can do certain things, and we're allowing you now to do more things that you can do that you did before. They don't realize that it's a virtual environment. For them, it's just another environment. It's if we've taken their laptop and created another environment. There's a lot of technology that goes into making the user experience so seamless, in which you can move between environments, you can control the copy and pasting, you can sync the settings on the virtual environment versus the host and make them look essentially as they're almost as one. Those are the primary differences between just deploying a VM, whether it's VirtualBox or any other commercial VM that's out there, to the approach that we've taken with this Workspace Isolation.
Great answer to that question. So our next question is, when GPU-intensive software is required in the Isolate environment, how would this relate to running directly on the device? Asking around Solid Edge/CAD software.
Yeah, so specifically with Solid Edge or CAD software, one of the new things with this Workspace technology, that it does enable GPU pass-through, which means that we can use the GPU capabilities that are on the device. Because we're using some of Microsoft's newest technologies on Windows 10 to make this happen, and therefore you can essentially use GPU-intensive applications either in the host or in the workspace or in the guest. There's obviously going to be some level of degradation, and there's always some level of degradation when you're using virtual environments. But the ability that we've implemented in this case allows us to use GPU pass-through, and therefore you'll get pretty good results from that perspective.
Great. Our next question is, what happens to software installed within the controlled VM after the VM session ends? Does the VM file system along with the installed software disappear, or does the software survive the end of the VM?
Yep, so that's another good question. What we're doing essentially is we are creating essentially a virtual disk for this VM, and we are mounting that virtual disk to the VM every time it's launched. When the VM session ends, the VM session ends essentially every time you reboot your device. The disk remains. However, it's encrypted using BitLocker, same type of technology that you're using today to encrypt your native device. But the user, if someone gets hold of that file, it's essentially worthless to them because it's encrypted. Very similar again to the way you would treat your own hard drives today. If and when you determine that that entire workspace needs to be decommissioned, and you send the command from the management server to do that, the entire system goes away, does not leave any residual. So there's no, even the encrypted data or the encrypted disk with the files is no longer there. I hope that answered the question.
Great. The next question we have is, if you deploy a corporate OS to a BYOD or third-party device, then are there licensing implications? Surely setup time must be noticeable as the corporate OS image needs to be downloaded and installed, or is it a one-time even and then reused on subsequent sessions?
Yeah, so that's another good question. So let me clarify a few things here. First of all, you essentially don't need to bring a corporate OS. Okay, that's the big innovation here. We're essentially taking a raw, pristine OS based on the binaries that are already installed on that device and creating a clean VM from it. That's the way we initially create the virtual environment or the workspace, what we're calling it. Within that, you as the managing entity can now determine its settings and its policies, whether the user has admin rights, what its network settings are, what its clipboard policies are in terms of copying data from that environment to the host. But you didn't have to bring your own corporate ISO. What you can do is use these the capabilities that we call app bundling. So you can create similar to what you would do with an Intune or an AirWatch, and we will be able to integrate with those services as well, is now provision this environment with all your corporate applications and settings, which means that you will be able to provision that. At that stage, we take a snapshot of that environment and can resume to that every single time the user launches the environment, and therefore the launch times are seamless. The workspace or the virtual environment is typically up and running within less than a minute after you've rebooted.
Great. Our next question that we have here is, how do you get around Microsoft licensing? You are, in effect, running 2 copies of Windows on a single device.
So yeah, that's a good question. What we're doing is we're actually using some of Microsoft's technologies that they've recently built into Windows 10 around sandboxing and containers. So we're not hacking the system. We're using the capabilities that they are providing to create an on-the-fly virtual environment. But what we've done is we've built capabilities to create persistency with this environment by preserving its state, its data, so that every time we recreate it, we can essentially go back to that that previous state. So again, no need to bring another license, and we're using the capabilities and the APIs that are built into Windows 10 and not circumventing them.
Great. The next question that we have is, so what happens if the host OS is contaminated? Do you verify it before using the installed OS as your base for a clean environment?
Very good question. So I would say that there's a few angles to this answer. One is, when the VM is created on the fly, it essentially goes through an integrity check that we're only using the signed binaries from Microsoft. So if one of the components in the core OS were tampered with, the VM won't mount and won't load, essentially making the solution unusable. The other aspect of some of the security measures that we've put in place is off-the-shelf malware that's installed on the host won't be able to see into the VM, won't be able to take screenshots of what's going on in the VM, won't be able to access the keyboard or the keystrokes and be able to keylog what's going on. So while that doesn't answer the question specifically, I already answered the question about the tampering with the operating system. We also provide many other security controls to prevent the tampering with or the access to what's going on in the VM, even if there is off-the-shelf malware on the device itself.
Great answer. So we still have a couple more questions here. How is Isolate Workspace better than VDI? Does it work well on a workstation that might already have VDI installed?
So, I think that VDI is a very, very mature technology. I mean, it's been around for at least 20 years. It's gone through lots of evolutions. We actually see this type of workspace technology integrating or working very well in organizations that already have VDI, and I'll give you examples or what I mean by that. If you think of VDI, essentially was once upon a time the way to give access to corporate applications from anywhere. You would have a desktop essentially running somewhere in data center, and you'd be able to access it with all the corporate applications that you wanted installed on that desktop. What's happened over the last 10 years is so many of our corporate applications have essentially become cloud applications, whether it's Office 365 or G Suite or some of the SAPs of the world. So many applications have now become cloud-based that it actually makes little sense going from my endpoint to a desktop that's somewhere in the cloud, only to go out now to Microsoft Cloud or to Google's Cloud or to Oracle's Cloud or to SAP's Cloud, access an application, and then stream it all the way back down to the end user's device. We actually think that the new way we should combine using, you should have all your native applications on your device, applications that you want to access from the cloud in a secure way, access them from a secured container or from a workspace on your endpoint using Workspace type of technology, Isolate type of technology. But also, if you do have applications that either for compatibility reasons or manageability reasons, continue running a few of those applications in VDI and letting the users access them when they need to. So you can reduce some of your licensing costs, you can reduce some of the bandwidth and data center costs because you're only using VDI for those, I would call them legacy or very, very unique applications that need to live in your data center or need to be accessed and are not part of a typical SaaS type of deployment.
Great, we still have a couple more questions here, so I'm going to keep them coming for a few more minutes. Somebody asked, we have a relatively flat network. One challenge we have is that developers need to access internal network technologies and integrations, so we can't fully isolate them, but they want to download tools ad hoc as well. Does Isolate help with that challenge?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we actually do have the use case for developers as someone that, or as one that we do deal with quite often with customers. Giving the developers a separate environment in which you can give them admin rights and they can install all their applications is what they need essentially. I'll call it an official jailbreak. So you're giving them a way in which they can now install on a clean operating system any application that they want. You can give them you can isolate that, not just, so it's isolated by being a virtual environment, and therefore anything they install in there, if it's potentially contaminated, won't exfiltrate itself onto your corporate device. But you can also then tunnel that workspace, even if you're on a flat network, through a VPN service. It could be a Zscaler or it could be some other cloud-based VPN. You can then tunnel that workspace directly out to the cloud, out of your network. Meaning, even if they do contract malware in that environment, there's no lateral movement from a networking perspective, because the only access that container, that workspace has, is to the outside internet through this VPN, which is essentially acting now as an encapsulation tunnel and not allowing any malware or any bad stuff to proliferate outside from the networking perspective into your network. Again, if you've got a flat network, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to implement that.
Great. So can the container be either persistent or session-based?
Yes, absolutely. You can determine in the settings, determine that the container will be, every time the user reboots or every time the user logouts will essentially be reset to a clean state, or you can keep persistency.
So from a BYOD or third-party support staff, you then need Windows 10 1907 as a base OS. Would that support iMac users using Windows-based applications?
So let me try and clarify. For Windows 10, to install Workspace on Windows 10, you need 1903 and later, and that's a rev that came out in May 2019. So we're now over a year past that. So any patched, updated Windows 10 device will essentially support Workspace. And by the way, this is not just for Workspace Enterprise or for Windows 10 Enterprise, but also for Windows 10 Pro and Home. So from a BYOD perspective, this will support any Windows 10 device that's been updated in the last year. When it comes to supporting Mac, obviously we can't run Windows on Mac. That's almost science fiction natively. But what we will be supporting early next year is the ability to run Windows, a VM with Windows in it on a Mac device, and you'll be able to manage it in the same way as you're managing your Windows devices as well. So the same policies, the same clipboard policies, the same networking, the same application bundling will be applicable in those environments as well. It will be slightly different flavor of Workspace, obviously, but as you know, most organizations are used to using some type of a different flavor of services for Mac to generate consistency.
Great. Is this the same approach as Bromium?
Oh, great question. So Bromium's, I would say Bromium is categorized in what the industry is called application sandboxing or application isolation, which means that you're essentially taking individual applications and you're wrapping them in a virtual environment in some type of a container, which provides you with the isolation that you need, so that if this application detonates some type of malware, it's contained in that virtual environment and provides you with that isolation. The difference compared to what we're doing is we're giving you an entire operating system. We're not individually wrapping applications, and the challenges with individually wrapping applications are you're creating multiple you're creating multiple VMs, which is quite intensive from a CPU perspective or from a compute perspective. The other thing is you essentially have to create compatibility, or you have to tailor the virtual environment to every single application. And what we've seen with solutions like that is that there's a compatibility race that constantly needs to take place. Every time a new version of the application is released by the vendor, there needs to be adaptations that are done. In this case, because we're running Windows as an entire operating system, any application that runs on Windows, and of course no one will release an application on Windows that's not supported on the most up-to-date operating system, there's no compatibility chase or race to begin with, because it's running in a native Windows environment that needs to be compatible with it. And there's no drag from a performance perspective because it's one single virtual environment. The other thing is that you're essentially creating the ability to have an entire workspace, which means that the user can use the same files, can download things onto that environment, can move things around, not moving between different virtual environments, but all in a single environment, essentially giving them the same user experience that they are used to from their typical corporate environment.
Great, and we've got one last question for you here. Are you planning to support the on-premise for Isolate management server?
Yes, well, that's another great question. The answer is, for now, we are not planning to do that. The first release of Workspace was, a SaaS application. The reasons behind that are as follows. The COVID-19, I think, has given us all the proof point that things that were in the cloud, accessible from anywhere, regardless of whether you were in the firewall, out the firewall, in which location you were, those companies that were more cloud-based from their IT perspective we're able to weather the storm of the transition from moving from working, in the office to remotely more effectively, and we're trying to follow that path. It's based on a lot of customer feedback, and we feel that the advantages of being in the cloud in terms of the speed in which we can upgrade and keep the service updated. A big part of the service is the manageability aspects, and the advantages of SaaS applications is that they move quickly. They have very little dependencies. Customers can get features very, very quickly. And of course, the service is available to anyone from everywhere. And therefore, we've taken that approach.
Great. So that's all of the questions that we had for today. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. And thank you to Mark for sharing your insight and expertise. If you have any additional questions or would like to connect directly with us at Isolate, you can reach out to me at marielle@isolate.com, and I'll put you in touch with the appropriate person. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Marielle, thanks very much for hosting us, and thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.